Where I'd like us to start is really for you to lay out, I think, for our wider Northern audience, really who Aontú is, how it came about, and why you think your values are important in the political market in Northern Ireland as well as the Republic.
Well, listen, thanks very much for the opportunity. Greatly appreciated. And I suppose just to break down who Aontú is, the word Aontú obviously is an Irish word, and it means unity or it means agreement, and actually comes from the verb Aontíamnat, I agree with you. And the reason we chose that word, obviously, because the Irish language is very much part of our culture, but also Irish unity is a big objective of Aontú. But the fact that we want to do it by unifying the people in an agreed fashion is also inherent in the name. We're a brand new political party. We were founded in 2019, early 2019, and so we're just over 3 years old. And in that time, we've probably gathered people from Sinn Féin, Fianna Fáil, and SDLP in the main, from as in votes and supporters. But I would say easily 50% of our membership are people who have never had a political home before. We've obviously, in our short period of time, we've fought a good few elections, north and south. We're polling around between 2, 3, and 4% in the south of Ireland at the moment. In the last election, the Westminster election in the north, we got a higher vote than People Before Profit and the Green Party in that election. And we have currently 1 TD, and we have 5 councillors between Wexford and Derry at the moment. So our major objectives, politically speaking, first of all, is Irish unity. We want to see Irish unity, but we're very practical around our objectives for Irish unity. I always see the border as, let's say, a wall with 1,000 blocks. Each block is a barrier to trade or to healthcare or to education or to retail or universities, all of those issues. And our view is that if we can isolate the individual problem, delete the barrier, and make life better or services more efficient in their delivery, it'll simply just improve people's lives on that basis. And if we can do that across the I suppose, spectrum of issues that affect life, it'll also have the effect of lowering the height of the border. So on that sunny day, when there is unity, the transition from 2 states to 1 state won't be as difficult. So that means obviously like an All-Ireland, let's say, ambulance service, or an All-Ireland excise duty rates, an All-Ireland corporation tax, even the ability for police services to, let's say, hot pursuit across the border. So the border isn't a competitive advantage for criminals. Now, obviously, we would have issues currently with some elements of, let's say, MI5, being part of the PSNI intelligence services, etc. But in the future, we would like to see that. Economic justice is a really important element of who we are as well. We would say economically we're left of centre, in that we want to make sure that there's decent public services for people first and foremost, decent public housing for people, and a health service that's free at the point of entry, as well. Now we do have I would say the difference between ourselves maybe and Sinn Féin economically would be we're probably more enterprise orientated. So I come from an enterprise background myself, and we do believe there needs to be a spark. There needs to be a reason for people to invest, to work hard, to take risks, to spend time in education. There needs to be an economic benefit in those activities for wealth to be created to create the public services that you want. So it's a mixed economy that we're looking for. And I would say for the Nordic economic model is probably close to where we stand on the economic spectrum in that. We would be a human rights political party too. And obviously the rights to life, we would see as a human right that should be afforded to everybody. It should be a universal right. We shouldn't take anybody that's human out of that right. And obviously the north of Ireland has seen radical social change just in the last 2 or 3 years in that space. And I don't think anybody would have thought 2 or 3 years ago that the legislation that would exist would go so far. So right now, under the Westminster legislation, it is legal in the north to have an abortion up until birth if the child has a disability. There's no term limits at all, which is outstanding in many ways. So we know there's been big social changes in society. We know it's going to be very hard, to roll it back, but we do think that a little bit of humanity has to be brought back into society. So around issues such as disability, pain relief, gender selection, abortion, etc. And to be honest, what probably differentiates us with other people in that pro-life space is we believe that we need to make sure that mothers have the economic ability to be able to raise their children, and that's really important to us. So it's not a case that when the child is born that society should forget about its responsibilities to mothers and their children. Right now, for example, there will be mothers giving birth homeless, and we just think that no mother on the island should ever have to think, can I afford to have my family to proceed with my pregnancy? That question needs to be eradicated as such. Another aspect of who we are, I suppose, is that we abhor groupthink. We would be of the view that the competition of ideas is really, really important. And so, some people in society have felt, let's say, a cancellation culture arise or a chilling effect on thinking or articulation of views. And we believe that if views are firmly held, if they're respectfully articulated, we need to make sure that they're able to be articulated, both on a personal level and within the media, because it's the competition of ideas that's most likely to allow for society to achieve the right results in a liberal democracy. Just in relation to the mediums of ideas, we also want to see a diversity of those mediums as well, because many of them now are held with large corporations who wield enormous control over the supply of ideas, and obviously the big Twitter debate at the moment is an example on that. So that's who we are. People will see that the work we do is very much orientated towards housing and healthcare and education, anti-corruption, and accountability is a big element of who we are. And we also do enormous work on homelessness. We do enormous work in relation to refugees and making sure that refugees are not ill-treated. We do enormous work in terms of people who are trafficked. And so we would have a strong social understanding of the world as well.
I have a particular interest in policy, and a belief that policy is really an important thing because it signals not just your general values, but actually how you might practically go about realizing some of those values. There's things like what you said about the competition of ideas, center left on economics, pro enterprise, very clear sets of values. But what sort of proposals are you thinking about in terms of making some of those values actually come to life for the people that you want to vote for you?
Okay, well, in the North at the moment, I believe actually there's a policy deficit. In many ways, I actually think political parties are very light on in-depth policy analysis. And that's, I suppose, a nature of two things. One, that many of the votes have been won and lost on the orange and green in the past. And secondly, because a lot of the powers economically are held in Westminster. So, people happen to immerse themselves in policy at a deep level in the running of the state in the north of Ireland. So what clearly differentiates ourselves and others is we think that economically the north is in big trouble. So the north's dependency on the block grant has meant that in housing, in healthcare, in education especially, there are major problems coming down the road. The Minister for Education in the north admitted that there's a £750 million deficit in education in the north from between now and 2025. And actually, the north is cut back on investment in education more than any other devolved administration on these islands. It has now one of the lowest pupil to teacher ratios currently. If you look at in healthcare, it's actually spending less per patient than in Scotland, Wales, or England, and absolutely in the south. In housing, there's a real crisis in housing, and actually money in housing is going to be diverted into healthcare very shortly. 2% of departmental budgets are to be rerouted, according to the draft budget recently, into healthcare, and that's at a time where rents are increasing by 5.5% on an annual basis, where house prices are increasing by £18,000 a year, where 44,000 people currently are on the housing waiting list. And remember, that's double what the figure was when 15 years ago. So after 15 years of Sinn Féin, DUP, SDLP, UUP and Alliance government, we have a doubled waiting list on housing. So what we want to do is stop the politics of dependency. We need to start devolving taxation powers from London to Belfast. Now, already we have corporation taxes devolved, but none of the parties have had the backbone to use that tax. We believe it should be equalized with the south of Ireland. And I'm amazed, some of the debate that happens, well, if you lower the corporation tax, is that not going to lower the amount of money that comes into the state? If you lower the corporation tax right now into the north of Ireland, it'll increase the amount of money coming into the state, because right now, the north would have a phenomenal competitive advantage with regards to FDI. It's in a sweet spot, obviously, because of the protocol. It has lower input costs currently than the south. And if it had the same corporation tax, it would hit the ball out of the park, I believe, with regards to foreign direct investment there.
Let me just come in on that, Peadar, because I think that's really interesting. We've had this debate. Part of the reason why I think the executive up to now has been a bit behind the ball in terms of, well, partly spending far too much time not actually doing their job. 3 years with the executive down, which any fool can see. But also there is a major concern that whilst you're right that cutting the cost of entry for FDI companies coming into Northern Ireland would create huge benefits within the private sector, it wouldn't do anything to tackle things like housing necessarily, or the deficits within education, or the massive amount of money that's going to need to be injected into the health center, the health service. Those are, in many ways, political decisions that are dictated by whichever party happens to be in Westminster. So I'm not really sure. I get the logic. I get the logic, but I'm not really sure that you're actually dealing with the consequences of that particular.
There's 3 points. There's 3 points I want to talk about there. First of all, 5% of the budget of the north of Ireland comes from elements outside of the block grant. So rates, etc., and the funding that was given with the New Deal. In Scotland, it's about 25%. In Wales, it's about between 10 and 15%. Why? Because they have more taxation raising powers. A bigger portion of public spending in those two jurisdictions come from taxes that they are involved in generating. Another point you mentioned, obviously, about the crashed devolution that exists in the north. That is one of our biggest campaign issues. We just think it's absolutely intolerable. No other democracy on the planet would allow for such economic and social difficulties to exist and have a suspended political system. It's not tolerable. It has to end. And actually, I don't think that the Southern government and even the Southern population realize how gutted the Good Friday Agreement is. The Good Friday Agreement does not exist in reality. It exists on paper. The executive, which is a major element of the Good Friday Agreement, does not exist. And the North-South Ministerial Council, which is one of the reasons why many nationalists voted for the Good Friday Agreement, doesn't exist. Even the Irish Language Act doesn't exist. So one of our policies would be that no one political party should be allowed to crash the executive anymore. End of story. It's just intolerable. And that would actually create the opportunity for an opposition to exist. And the North needs an opposition. For example, in 10 years, the 5 executive parties took 870 beds out of the health service just before COVID. Nobody mentioned it because they're all responsible for it. And if you had an opposition pushing a government and ensuring that they were held to accountable, it would be far more likely that those types of issues would be brought to a fore. But in regards to taxation, don't get me wrong, we're not a low corporation taxation party by nature, but we do want to see it equalize with the South. If you equalize it, first of all, more international companies will come in. The amount of corporation tax will actually increase within 3, 4, 5 years. Also, the amount of jobs that will exist will increase. The amount of income tax that will come from those jobs will increase. And also the VAT receipts on the basis of the spending from those wages will increase. So we believe that there will be a net increase in the level of of income to the states if corporation tax is equalized. And one other point, because I'm often asked about, like, unity, and unity being a threat economically to the north. A person living in Dundalk, is not cleverer than a person that lives in Uri. A person living in Letterkenny is not more enterprising than a person living in Derry. A person living in Monaghan is not more enterprising than a person living in Dungannon. The difference between those two jurisdictions is because the south has self-determination and the north doesn't. London treats the north like an economic backwater. It also treats the north of England, to be honest, and Scotland, like second-rate elements of the economy. It's very much, London is home counties orientated. And, the fact that the wealth and productivity elements of the island flipped from north to south as a direct result of self-determination over the last century is an example of why self-determination is an economic competitive advantage.
I'm interested in this idea of stopping the politics of dependency. And I guess you work that into the kind of grand narrative of why you're a Republican stroke nationalist party, because you see greater agency coming out of being closer to Dublin, where, look, I'm second generation Donegal. I know what people in Donegal think about Dublin. There is a similar effect to what you're talking about, because capital cities end up chewing up large amounts of the national, domestic product. All taxes all end up in Dublin, as they do in London. So there is this kind of vacuuming effect that kind of happens. And the other thing to point out a little bit as well is that Northern Ireland actually is doing okay, even without that lower corporation tax. But it's all happening in Belfast, and none of it's really getting out towards Derry. So that's just almost by way of comment rather than a direct question.
Yeah, but I agree with you. I do believe we have a lopsided island. There's no doubt that Dublin's overheating. A third of the southern state is a sprawling commuter belt, and then a lot of the regional rural areas are losing their young populations. There's no that has a similar east to the west of the Ban experience at the north. But I do believe that's a policy mistake that the government have made. And we want, as part of our manifesto, a border innovation zone where there would be actually economic advantages into investing into the border zone, because that hinterland was basically sundered by partition. It needs extra help in terms of coming back. But I will say to you, most enterprise needs a number of things. It needs a well-educated workforce. It needs good communication technology. It needs good transportation technology, and it needs efficient inputs. Infrastructural development is really, really key for the location of enterprise. And regional balance is critical for us. In Denmark, for example, they had a lopsided economy, and they decided, okay, they would choose a location outside of Copenhagen to rebalance spatially. And they chose a town called Aarhus, which was a town of about 50 to 60,000 people. And they made it the default location for new infrastructure. So if new infrastructure is to happen, it would happen in Aarhus first. And what's happened is it has developed into a critical mass that it's now able to draw down international investment in its own right. And its population is about 3 times, 4 times what it was 30 or 40 years ago. And that's where a good government makes a logical decision to rebalance spatially. And Ireland needs that. And what we would be looking for would be 2 locations, one north and one south, where we actually say these are default infrastructural hubs. We want to build them to a critical mass so that they will draw down international investment.
Are you going to tell us which of those 2 hubs are?
Well, to be honest, I won't say. And the reason being is because I actually don't believe politicians choose them, because politicians will make a hames of choosing them, to be honest. They'll choose them for all the wrong reasons. But what I will say is that there should be a criteria built on the basis of, a location, ports, and all of the existing ingredients for economic development. And they should be judged, Derry should be judged, Limerick should be judged on the basis of that. And the decision shouldn't have anything got to do with an elected rep. It should be carried out by people, of the quality of judges, for example. Because definitely, if politicians do it, it'll be for the wrong reasons.
This is one of the downsides of proportional representation, where the TDs or the MLAs are so close to the parish that they can't see beyond the parish. We now have deputies for the county of Kerry who don't really care about the rest of the kingdom first and the republic second. So I get all that. There's two things I wanted to ask you about before we finish. One is, a lot of what we talked about just now are implicit in some of the Shared Island initiative of the Taoiseachs. And just rather than to say whether you approve or disapprove of that, to what extent do you think that is a valuable policy initiative and something that perhaps you would see developing, or is that something you would just take a wrecking ball to and start from scratch?
Well, I do welcome it, and I have to say, I do think that Fianna Fáil and the political spectrum in the South has been moved onto slightly newer grounds just within the last 2 or 3 years, and Brexit has helped in that. There's no doubt that political parties, that wouldn't articulate a view, that was in any way different than the British government, are now moved on to a space where they realise it's an All Ireland, and there is an All Ireland future there. And even I'm listening to the new Labour Party leader just in questions with the Taoiseach that I'm just up from about 5 minutes ago, saying, talking about the need for an agreed All Ireland development. So there's very few political parties in the South that's not discussing that for a change. We would go a step further. We were pushing the New Ireland Forum there for the last 3 or 4 years. I think the SDLP jumped on the idea as well recently too. We want a forum, especially where civic society is brought in. For example, 3 years ago, I carried out I was a rapporteur for the Enterprise Committee in Leinster House, and I was tasked with the job of carrying out an investigation into the All-Ireland economy and on behalf of the Oireachtas. It was the first time the Oireachtas had carried out such an investigation since partition, believe it or not. And in that investigation, I got to talk to hundreds of people from loads of different backgrounds, Catholic, Protestant, Unionist, Nationalists, and everybody in between. And people from unions, businesses, health organizations, charities, and what have you. And literally, I could probably summarize an agreed space that people came up with. If we plan together, if we finance together, and if we deliver together, services will be better services, they'll be more efficient, and they will improve people's lives. So I think we need to start to do that methodically. We need to actually say, in a structured, systematic way, let's go through everything that exists on the island and see how we can start to do that in a systematic fashion. And if we bring in that New Ireland Forum, especially with civic society, and maybe allow for political parties to be involved as well, it should have, I think, 3 or 4 objectives. 1, to ameliorate any fallout from Brexit. 2, to build the All Ireland economy. And 3, to start to look at what Ireland would look like in the future in terms of an agreed Ireland or a united Ireland. And I think if it had that job of work, I think you would see a lot of good preparation that would simply improve people's lives first and foremost. And also, the problem, if Sinn Féin talk about, a referendum on unity, if we don't do that work in advance, we'll find ourselves in a similar position the Tories were when they called the Brexit, referendum with none of the preparation done in advance. And that's the danger. The prep needs to be done so that, when the referendum happens, there is a clear vision of what's on offer, and a lot of the work is ironed out and the wrinkles ironed out beforehand.
There's a lot of what you say I think makes a lot of sense compared to what is conventional wisdom. Now, I like the analogy of the wall. I like the idea of removing it brick by brick, because that allows you to prosecute social good in the here and now, rather than say, you know what, lads, we just starve ourselves another day or another 6 months or whatever, we will get jammed tomorrow, which is, I think, the public feeling of nationalism. And it's reflected in some of the data that we see coming out of the Liverpool survey, where only 30% of people actually want or say they would vote for United Ireland now. And I know there's all sorts of problems of it not being described, but that's the reality at the moment. We are that far away from a successful referendum outcome. but there also seems to be there's this twin failure here to understand the other side.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot in that, and I'll say we've got a lot of communication from unionists over the last number of weeks, especially when our party political broadcast came out. And I get a lot of emails, and I don't want to overblow it. Like, not this, but we're talking about dozens of emails and communications from unionists, and I have to say they've all been phenomenally positive. And this is probably controversial for me to say this. There's a theme running through them all. There's nearly more opposition towards Sinn Féin than there is towards unity or the Irish language in all of those communications. And it's like Sinn Féin has been linked or has been the representative of those two ideas, that the culture and the idea in their minds, and therefore, let's say the trinity of those things have been pushed back on so much. And I have been, like, obviously as my previous background, I've been quite shocked to see that the Sinn Féin's, let's say, probably history, to be honest, has been a big element in the resistance of many people, I think, in the unionist community towards those two objectives. So, of those people, and I'm not saying at all that they are majority representative, but of those people, there's definitely a feeling that, you know, we could talk about unity, or we could talk about at least an agreed Ireland, but we're not going to do it with Sinn Féin. We could talk about the Irish language. We could consider the Irish language, but we're not going to do it with Sinn Féin. So, and I think that maybe we are well positioned, and we've done I've carried out a major effort to reach out towards Protestants, towards unionists in terms of our political platform. I was on a meeting with people from the Protestant community last night. I attended one 2 weeks ago in Belfast, in the Methodist hub outside of Queen's University. And unbelievably, it really struck me that there's so much of those two cultures that are actually very similar. There are many shared values. Now, I know that people would say the Catholics have that kind of community responsibility, just from the fact that, you know, we were meant to, of Mass, and the priest was our relationship with God, while Protestants have the individual personal responsibility because their relationship was individually and personally with God, and that has had an effect on the cultural, let's say, approaches towards everything, even in a post, let's say, religious society. But I actually think, and I'm a strong believer in diversity, I think that a diverse society is a stronger society. And I think we would be, and I know this probably sounds a little bit, it's been said so many times, but I do think that Ireland is a far richer place with contrasting, different Irish people and ways of being Irish. And I'll go as far as this, and this might sound strange as well. Reconciliation in the North has always, I think, been taken slightly the wrong direction. Reconciliation has nearly been about the equalizing of us. So if I'm to reconcile, as a Republican, to reconcile with a unionist, I need to wear unionist clothes, or at least, you know, try them out now and again in terms of, you know, commemorations or events or cultural aspects. And if unionists are really to reconcile with us, they have to do similar. But actually, no, I think that true pluralism is where we reconcile by being different. You know, I can be reconciled with a unionist celebrating Easter 1916, celebrating the Irish language, or celebrating Gaelic football or hurling. And they can be equally reconciled with me by celebrating their Britishness and all that goes with the British culture. And you know, and that's why I think sometimes we've got slightly mistracked on that element of reconciliation. And reconciliation can nearly become a threat then, because if a person is to move into this modern reconciled Ireland, that means they nearly have to move a little bit to the other side's clothing politically. And I don't think that's how it should be.
One of the things that the data is telling us about how people are changing is that those two blocks still exist I mean, you'll know it because the places where you're knocking doors will be in areas, rural areas, where social conservatism amongst Catholic populations is still quite high, where mass attendance is still relatively high. Where it starts to disappear is in the metropolitan areas, where the Alliance Party is expected to show really well. And what's happening, I think, is less to do with those two traditional identities and much more to do with the hybridization of identity.
Just can I make one point on that, if that's all right? Because I think that is an interesting. One thing I will say is we're obviously running 12 candidates in the north, and I firmly believe that we are competitive in at least 4 of those constituencies. So in about 4 constituencies in the Westminster election, we polled just under 5%. Now Westminster suppresses the vote of small political parties because everybody's plumping for one of the 2 winners. Now we need to get over 8 or 9% to be in play for the last seat in those constituencies. And I've no doubt that in West Belfast, East Derry, Foyle, and Fermanagh South Tyrone, we will be knocking on 8 or 9% in those constituencies. But I will say, working class areas have a different view, let's say, on the right to life than, let's say, South Belfast might have. So when we're going into West Belfast, and I was quite shocked by this. We weren't raising the issue of the right to life, but the issue of the right to life has been raised with us, 3 out of every 4 doors. 3 out of every 10 doors. Now, obviously, they may have raised it with us because obviously it's a key value of ourselves. But we were surprised in West Belfast of the really strong pool of that kind of human rights understanding of the world that exists there, and that was equally strong as it would be in East Derry, in the likes of Dungiven or in Limavady, or in places like Dungannon as well. So I actually think that some of the media have missed a trick a little bit in relation to probably not focusing on that issue as a political issue in this election, because it definitely is coming up at the doors.
You've mentioned, well, I counted 3 constituencies, but you mentioned 4: Foyle, West Belfast, and East, as I call it, Londonderry, because that is the official title. What was the 4th one that you mentioned?
Fermanagh South Tyrone. We have a good councillor there, Denise Mullen, a former SDLP councillor, and actually a woman who's gone through, obviously, her father was murdered in front of her when she was 4 years old by the UVF, and the UVF perpetrator of that murder, Garfield Beattie, has been sending her death threats recently in the name of the East Tyrone UVF Brigade. He's back in jail as a result of it, but 200 of her posters have been taken down, and she feels, that's part of it. But it's terrible when you think about it. From the age of 4 to 50, she's been, hassled and harangued and damaged by a group of individuals.
Yeah. I mean, this is Arlene Foster's story too. This is the story of so many people in rural Ulster who know who did the job, and in many cases, there simply isn't. So legacy is it's been a big issue, but what's been notable to me is just how incompetently it's been handled, because people like this still exist. They're still isolated. And if they're not considered a cause célèbre by, rich charities, they are simply forgotten. And there is a huge underbelly of resentment, I think. Have Aontú had any thoughts?
2 points on that. We've introduced 2 bills into Leinster House in recent times. The first one is what we call the Dáil for All bill, which allows would allow for Northern MPs to be able to attend Dáil sittings, speak and ask questions, not to vote, because the South is not ready for that at the moment. But and that bill has passed first stage. We've also passed at the committee of the Good Friday Agreement a motion seeking for Northern MPs to be able to speak as per right in all the committees in the South. But we've just introduced a bill which would seek to set up a commission of investigation into legacy issues in the north of Ireland. Now, it would focus on British collusion, etc. But we're willing to speak to people in relation to potentially broadening it out. And now it has challenges for sure, because it's located in this jurisdiction. It would only allow us to compel witnesses and documents from this jurisdiction. It could take evidence and documentation from outside of the jurisdictions. So I'd be hopeful that people like the police ombudsman in the north of Ireland, who's done terrific work in terms of investigations, would be able to sit in front of the commission and give evidence. It would also be able to take reports that have been officially written and consider them in its decision making with regards to what's happened. And we're actually hoping that similar legislation could be implemented in the Assembly, which would then involve the compelling of witnesses north and south in terms of that.
Okay, so if you're going to pick one of the 4 constituencies where you think you've got a good chance, how much would you recommend we put on it, and which bookie do you think is good for which constituency?
Is if this is recorded, is it, or will it? Well, to be honest, I'm not going to name a constituency. I do think that West Belfast, East Derry are definitely ones to watch. But we have a great councillor in Emma Doyle in in Foyle, and in Denise Mullen, a councillor in Tyrone. So all of those are in play. There's no doubt about that. And I will say as well, you know, what we've managed to do on this occasion is we've managed to build a far stronger organisation. I would say our membership is close to what the SDLP membership in the north is at the moment. And also we have chosen candidates of a seriously high calibre from South Down to East Antrim, who will be definitely in competition for council seats in the local election. Yeah. And we know as a small political party that this is let's say a multi-election strategy for us. We need to get to about 2.5 to 3% of the votes in this election, which will bring us to about 5% of the vote amongst nationalism. And once we get into 8 or 9% of the vote then by the local election, then you'll see council seats come our way.
That's great. Peadar Toibin, thank you very much for talking to us. That's been a fascinating overview of a party I think that a lot of people haven't really got their heads around. Obviously, when you're knocking doors, you can get to people and you can explain yourself, etc. But the way the news market is, I think, you know, they tend to focus on the big 5. In fact, actually, they barely focus on 3 of them, and it's mostly really on this big race between Sinn Féin and the DUP, which, you know, I think we could probably both agree it'll be a moment, but whether it's a moment of great change, I think I can't really see it if this failed partnership continues. But anyway, that's all for me. Thanks for joining us today, Peadar, and thanks to all of you watching. If you've liked this video, please do. If you enjoyed it, hit the like button. And if you want to hear more from us, hit the notification button, the little bell icon, and you won't miss the next video.